I'm Nick Potts. I'm an architect. Today we're on Wall Street and we'll be doing an architectural walking tour of the neighborhood. Wall Street has this reputation of being the financial capital of the country, but the reason it's called Wall Street is that we're at the edge of the settlement of New Amsterdam, where really the city stopped right where it is and there is a defensive wall. Other things that happen at the edge of any settlement is trade, and that's exactly what is happening here in the Wall Street areas. There was trade amongst the indigenous populations immediately to the north as the colonists were finding things to sell to them. There's also the sale and trading of goods and commodities, and because this is America in that period, also the sale of people through slavery. So this is really the nexus of all the things that were being traded in America at this time. Right now we are on Wall Street at Broad Street, right outside of the New York Stock Exchange. Stock trading had existed on this site really as far back into the early 18th century. There was a series of outdoor auctions that actually took place here on Wall Street around 1793 that started to become formalized. So these outdoor markets, which originally took place under a tree, started taking place within coffee shops. And as technology developed and the whole business of trading commodities became more formalized, there's a need for space to do it. And as electricity, the telegraph made it possible for people in offices to communicate down through ticker tape to people on a floor, you started having a need for a trading floor. And so this building is really that sort of technology. What you have underneath this big neoclassical pediment is a giant floor where stock traders could mingle with one another. These giant windows are bathing light in this very deep, large space. The tall windows, height means light. And so what you have is a very high technology building hiding under the respectability of a Roman temple front. And you see the columns, these Corinthian columns, which are almost religious. But you start looking closer and it's much more Americanized. If you look at the sculpture in the pediment, these aren't gods. It's actually a representation of industry and the industry that made prosperity. You see mining, you see agriculture, you see industrial manufacturing, you see sciences, all represented in this pediment as if they're the things being worshipped within this modern temple. Another interesting thing to note about this, obviously there are no offices in this building. It's increasingly, as technology, lighting, and the ability to put more people in a large space became more pronounced, trading floors needed much more space. So this is really, it's actually quite small, and it's smaller than what you do now. The building stock that exists here really can't house modern finance, so a lot of the banks have moved uptown or further out where they can build much larger floor plates. And a lot of these buildings, because they're quite narrow, have been retrofitted as residences and hotels where you can have much narrower floor plates. We are on the corner of Liberty Street and Nassau Street, right in front of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. When the Federal Reserve System was created, New York could not appear to be the only one, so there are branch or actually equal Federal Reserves scattered across the country. And this building, though it looks very ancient, it's appropriating Renaissance forms. It's actually quite new, obviously because the Federal Reserve System didn't exist before then. In spite of its newness, it's trying as hard as it can to look old and stable and permanent. And if you look at the stone, so it's actually made of two types of stone. The more yellow blocks are sandstone, the whiter ones are limestone. So that sort of mixing of different stones was meant to look as if it had aged. It's similar to what you see at Yale, where they threw acid at buildings to kind of create a bit of instant history. And you can see by the size of the people walking by the stones of the building, just how huge these stones are. These are meant to express their permanence and their solidity. Here they went even one step further and did something called pulvinating, which is, it almost looks like a pillow. It's this giant rounded corner. And so that's expressing the bigness and the permanence and the stability of the building and our financial system. The type of building or the style of building that they appropriated for this, Renaissance palazzo, they were both places of commerce and fortresses for, if you think about the Medici and the extremely wealthy families in Renaissance Florence, these buildings were fortresses. And there's a little bit of that going on here. It's slightly castle-y. You see the crenellations at the top of the building. There's a tower. So it's meant to look stable and permanent and as if it could stand up to the onslaught of a war, should that happen, which is fitting for an institution that's meant to, house the reserves of our nation's finances. The metalwork is kind of doing two things here. For one, it looks impenetrable and fortress-like. It's also, if you look closer, a work of art. And this is the work of Samuel Yellin, who was the master of ironwork. He worked out of Philadelphia and did some of the most extraordinary ironwork of this country in the middle of the turn of the 19th century and the early 20th century. Now we are outside of 55 Wall Street. This is a building that's interesting in that it's changed over the course of its lifetime. It started in the 1840s as the Merchants Exchange. You can see on the bottom of the building, that was the original building. It was load-bearing masonry, a very simple Greek Revival sort of building, one row of Ionic columns. As the whole national financial market matured, that sort of exchange no longer needed a building like that. So they moved off, it became a customs house, and it became, in 1907, the headquarters for National City Bank. And so in order to make this their headquarters, taking over this more kind of publicly facing market building, they extended it vertically upwards in a steel building. And you can see the intersection of two styles. The very simple Ionic columns on the lower part of the building are superseded by these giant Corinthian columns in the Citibank expansion. Part of the reason that Wall Street has also been important is that it meets on the East River, one of the most important areas for offloading goods and shipments for the New World. So this building, at one point after the Merchants Exchange had moved out, was the customs house. So it was the place where customs and duties on goods coming in for the port were assessed. So the Merchants Exchange, when this was still the original tenant of the building, built something that looked like a temple, again, to show that it was viable and stable. And there's no better way to do that than to borrow from antiquity and classicism. So that's why the Ionic Order, it projects stability and permanence for a sort of institution, a trading floor that really didn't have a building type. And it wasn't something that people would say, oh, like this is what a stock exchange looks like. It didn't exist. So you borrow and you kind of appropriate from what people did know, which is, the past. The original Merchants Exchange was the 1840s. The addition was 1907. So the addition is actually right around the same time as the New York Stock Exchange. So it's kind of the second generation of buildings on this street and the second form. This is before skyscrapers, so the buildings are still somewhat low and more horizontal, but we're starting to edge up in the super capitalist era when buildings wanted to get much taller. And so you can see as these buildings became obsolete, they got taken over by new uses because the land is still valuable and turned into something new and different. So right now we are outside of 1 Wall Street on the corner of Wall Street and Broadway. This is obviously an Art Deco skyscraper. It follows the 1916 zoning resolution. So you notice as the building steps up, it gets smaller and smaller. This is partially to maintain light and air at the base of the building. And this is some of these competing interests that exist in downtown Manhattan, this need, because the real estate is so valuable, to essentially multiply the lot as many times as you can and charge as much rent, but then the competing public interest to preserve the public realm and make sure that we're not sacrificing the public realm for very tall buildings. And this is really one of the more perfect Art Deco skyscrapers that does this. The architect of this, Ralph Walker, really made his name doing AT&T buildings. And there's several in Tribeca, which were buildings that were all about technology and the optimism of the future. And in 1 Wall Street, he's taken a lot of those motifs and those stylized, non-historical, non-classical forms and has translated them into a very tall office building. You'll notice, unlike a more neoclassical building that would have a base, middle, and a top, in this building the lines run straight from the ground all the way up to the sky, almost as if the building is disappearing into the sky. If you look at the details of this building, it's really extraordinary. The windows in each of the tilted bays are all curved, which is something you don't really see. It's a very kind of custom, bespoke detail. When 1 Wall Street was built, it was an advertisement for the bank that built it. And so this was the most valuable piece of real estate in the country. And they bought this knowing that they wanted to build a very tall building and profess their stability, particularly because this building was going on during the Depression. They chose to go on to show, like, we are strong, we are solvent. And so building a big building during the Depression was the ultimate mark of confidence in the market and in the institutions. So a very tall building like this directly across from Trinity Church, which at the time was considered a very tall building, this is really the triumph of finance over religion. You can see this looming tall cascading spire of commerce directly in opposition to Trinity Church across the street. Right now we're in front of Trinity Church at the head of Wall Street in the financial district. This is actually the third Trinity Church that's existed on this site. The first one dated all the way back to 1698. It's a Gothic revival building. Trinity Church has really had a history that's mirrored a lot of the accumulation of wealth in downtown Manhattan. And it's this interesting combination if you think about it's at the foot of our most famous financial center, Wall Street, but it's a church. And it's very American kind of merging of the sacred and the financial. And Trinity Church is really the perfect example of this. As the church got wealthier, it grew. It continues to be one of the most important landlords in Manhattan. They were granted about 200 acres by Queen Anne in 1705. They still control a lot of that. As Trinity Church goes, so does Wall Street. When this was built, this was the tallest building in the country for quite some time after it was built. So you think about tall buildings, skyscrapers, and tall churches. It's kind of, again, this overlap in this paradox of Wall Street. Another interesting thing about this site is you see the pyramid right there. That's actually Alexander Hamilton, really the father of our financial system, is actually buried here at the head of Wall Street. So it's just, kind of the perfect American finance story here at Trinity Church. So we are standing in front of the Equitable Building at 120 Broadway. This is really the tall building that caused the tall buildings that would follow. If you think about the forces of finance want you to multiply a floor as much as possible and get as much rent as you can. That's exactly what happened. The building is essentially a rectangle of the lot shot straight up. When this was built, people freaked out. It was so tall, so scary, that the direct resultant of this building was what's known as the 1916 zoning resolution. The setbacks that were proposed as part of the 1916 zoning resolution meant that the building needed to get smaller and smaller to make sure that enough light hits the streets, that people aren't stuck in these dark canyons, which is exactly what people felt when this was built. It's a fairly straightforward Beaux-Arts building, just kind of multiplied on top of itself forever. One of the interesting tidbits about this is that the 1916 zoning resolution created the New York Department of City Planning, who's actually currently in this building. So there's a little bit of full circleness going on here where they created the zoning resolution against the building, but then they occupy the building that their jobs created. The Beaux-Arts style is really about classism. And the architects who were working in that style were looking back towards Paris. They're looking back towards people like Vitruvius and Alberti and these books of order and classism. And you can almost see a column in the building. There's a very defined base, a shaft, and then a top and a cornice. So the building both contains elements of classical architecture and the classical orders of architecture, but the building itself is also a representation of that, which is, as tall buildings became a type, people were going back and forth whether to apply historic forms and apply historic rules for buildings to them or to invent something totally new. And so this is in the more kind of reactionary historicist model as opposed to kind of the more inventive forms that came out of this. So directly next door to the Equitable Building, which created the 1916 zoning resolution, we see a more modern interpretation of a later zoning code, the 1961 zoning resolution in 140 Broadway. And in that more updated zoning, new rules came into place. Rather than just tapering, it introduced bonusing for a plaza. So this introduced these buildings, rather than a building going to the lot line and tapering up, the 1961 zoning resolution let you build taller if you would give more of the space back to the public. And so you see these towers on big plazas largely as a game to play against zoning to get a little bit more extra height through bonusing, create a plaza. It's generally a privately owned public plaza, so there are rules. It's not really a public space, but regardless, that still allowed the developer to build taller than they ordinarily would have been able to do.